We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
We're in London at the 2012 Paralympic Games, and swimmer Ellie Cole is telling herself she'll only go home a gold medalist. She's focused, determined and ambitious. Not only will she win gold, she'll do it 4 times over.
Ellie Cole, another gold medal.
4 years later, she's tipped to be a hot favourite to win another gold at the Rio 2016 Paralympic Games. The pressure is on.
Ellie Cole, absolutely phenomenal.
But Ellie rises to the occasion again, winning medals in all 6 of her events.
She's done it again, and she smashes the water into light.
This focus and determination has been with Ellie her whole life. At just 3 years old, she lost her right leg to a rare cancer. 8 weeks later, her mother took her down to the pool as part of her rehabilitation. Instructors thought it would take her a year to swim in a straight line. It took her just 2 weeks. I'm at Middleton, and this is Head Game. Today, inside the mindset of Australia's most decorated female Paralympic athlete. Ellie Cole, thank you ever so much for coming on my podcast, Head Game. You've got 17 medals. Is that correct? Have I missed any out?
No, that's right.
You've got 7. I'm surprised you're not wearing them. If that was me, I'd be wearing them, but I suppose it'd weigh you down. But before we get into the medals and your amazing accomplishments, it wasn't always an easy journey for you. Quite a hard question, I suppose, for yourself. What is your earliest memory as a child?
I would say I have this one memory of a child of waking up in my cot, actually, and I was crying. And I think on reflecting, it was probably to do with the pain in my right leg from my tumour that I was diagnosed with a few months later. But my earliest memory after that was actually in the rehabilitation ward after I'd just lost my leg and I was learning how to walk again. And there was this giant teddy bear at the end of the hallway, and I was always trying to walk towards this huge teddy bear. I went back a few years ago, and that giant teddy bear is actually not that giant at all. It's quite a standard size one, but because I was so small in the grand scheme of things, it seemed huge to me. So I think that's a nice memory to have because it just reminds me of how small I once was.
Wow, that's fascinating. So your actual first memory is of pain, of waking up because at the age of 3 you had a rare cancer and you had your leg amputated. What type of cancer was it, if you don't mind me asking also?
It was a neurosarcoma. So it would describe the pain because it was a cancer that was wrapped around the sciatic nerve in my leg. And I think anybody that has had sciatica would know how uncomfortable that is. I've had nerve damage in my leg before, once when I broke my hip a few years ago. And nerve pain is excruciating. So to have a cancer that is intertwined around a nerve, I'm sure would have caused me quite a bit of pain. I'm thankful that I don't have too many memories of that time. But I have been told by my parents that I was waking up and I was a very unsettled baby, and I think that is a pretty just explanation. But yeah, it was a nerve cancer, which is quite rare.
Wow, how did your parents identify the tumour?
There are a few indicators when I was young that something wasn't quite right. So the first one was I was unsettled. The second was I have a twin sister and she was much more developmentally advanced with her walking than I was. So she was walking a lot sooner and I was scooting around behind her on my bottom trying to keep up. And then the third indicator was my right leg was actually growing at a slower rate to my left because of the limited blood supply. And then the last indicator was the tumour presenting itself. Now, by the time the tumour had presented itself, I was about 2.5 years old. And the doctors believed that I was actually born with this cancer, but it wasn't physically presenting as a tumour until about 2.5.
And when you went to the hospital, it was identified straight away. And was the decision made straight away to to amputate your leg. How was the decision made? And ultimately, it was down to your parents to make it, right?
It was. So amputation is quite a drastic decision to make, and it's usually at a last resort. Back in 1994, when my leg was amputated, the prosthetics aren't as advanced as they are now. And so amputation back then, it really did limit your movement because the prosthetics available were also quite limited. So the decision to amputate my leg was made about a year after my diagnosis. I underwent chemotherapy to try and treat the tumour, and it wasn't working. In fact, it was attacking all of my white blood cells more than it was the cancer cells. And so chemotherapy became too dangerous. They took a biopsy of the tumour and tried to take it all out, but it was just growing back. And so nothing was effectively, they had exhausted all options and nothing was working. And so at risk of it spreading, they needed to amputate in order to ensure that that spread wasn't going to happen. And since the day that they've amputated, I have been a picture of health. I haven't had one cancer cell in my body, which has been amazing. So they did an incredible job, and it was the right decision. At that time, though, I didn't realise it was going to lead me down this amazing path of becoming a Paralympian. I love having a disability. I'm fortunate to have had a lot of amazing experiences, and I know that for people in the general community, some having a disability hasn't been a pleasant experience. But I've been able to use sport as an amazing platform and channel all of that through sport. So I've considered myself quite fortunate in that sense.
Because you were so young, do you think that helped you with your recovery, and that helped you for that to almost become the norm, that you weren't, with your two legs for, your teenage years, and all of a sudden you had your leg amputated? It was done at such a young age. Do you think that helped with the process? I
think so. I think that's a fair assumption, and I would be assuming just as much as you are, because I don't know what it's like to have two legs. I don't know any different. So I would see, able-bodied people and be like, whoa, that is a lot of limbs to have to navigate. You must feel like an octopus. For me, having one is so normal to me that I don't know any differently. And I think that has certainly helped with acceptance. The thing that I've still had to navigate, despite accepting it myself, is people's perception of what I'm able to do and my capabilities. And that's a really deep-rooted stigma and that we have in our society that's happened for centuries and centuries around disability. So that's something that I've had to overcome. But personally, having a disability hasn't been a huge journey of acceptance for me because I haven't known any differently.
Yeah. Once you had your leg amputated, was there a rehab where you were in the hospital for a long time? You couldn't integrate with children at school, home education. What did that look like?
So I lost my leg. I just turned 3 years old when I lost my leg. I did rehabilitation at the hospital. I think from what I've seen and from what I've heard, my mum would take me into the hospital and do rehabilitation with the paediatric physiotherapist there. And it was just simple games that they would play with me. Like there is a video that we have on home footage of the physiotherapist, and she's, throwing a balloon to me and she's trying to get me to weight bear on my prosthetic. And so I was actually in the process of healing without even realizing that I was. It was all just fun and games for me at that age. And so I was still able to, I suppose, integrate straight back into my old life, although I did look a little bit differently now that I was missing a leg. I went straight back home, was working with a physiotherapist, but was still playing alongside my siblings. And then I went to primary school at the same age as my twin sister. And I was really fortunate to have my twin sister there because, I think we learn so much through play when we're a kid. I was having a challenge in front of me, whether that was riding a bike or climbing a tree, things that were a bit more difficult for me than it was for my twin sister because I was missing a leg. But my sister and I always found some way to be able to get to the top of that tree or to be able to get onto the bike. And it was an amazing process of learning how to adapt to the environment around me. And how to find a solution no matter what it was, just through the simple act of play, where it almost became part of my mentality that there is a huge problem in front of me, but that's fine. It's almost a game to play where we can find a way to get to the top of the mountain. And I had that ingrained in me from a very young age because of my disability. So I do credit a lot of, I suppose, my determination to my disability. And I think that's why I'm quite fond of it, actually.
The water, when did someone think about chucking you in a swimming pool? Because was it at a young age? Was it part of your rehabilitation? When did someone go, oh, this is a good idea, we'll chuck Ellie in a swimming pool and see how she gets on?
Throw her in. It was just a few weeks after my amputation. And it's quite commonplace to have a swimming pool as a rehabilitation space. Because you can learn how to use your body again without worrying about gravity or putting too much load on your body.
Yeah, non-impact.
Non-impact. It's probably quite insensitive for me to want to head down to our local rehabilitation pool and pick out our next Paralympic superstars. But it genuinely is where a lot of our Paralympic swimmers have come from, as a rehabilitation pool. And so I went around in circles for a couple of weeks with my broken rudder. But once again, it was just a simple act of adapting to what I was doing, and I figured out how to swim in a straight line pretty quickly. And I was just then went through the normal learn to swim program that my twin sister was, and swimming wasn't that hard, as it turned out.
Wow, and I suppose as well, looking on the positive side and putting the disability aside, you were swimming from the age of 3. Having that confidence in the water is huge. It's a life skill. It's a life lesson, right?
Yeah, it really was. And I think the swimming pool was a safe space for me because you mentioned before, how great kids are. Once they see something that's different to them, they identify that very quickly, but then they just move on with their life. When I was younger growing up, I found the kids were very accommodating and accepting of my disability. It was actually the adults, without meaning to be. They always had good intentions, but they always had very deep-rooted experiences with what they assumed disability was, and was always pushing that on me. Like, you have this, so therefore this is what you're going to do. And the swimming pool for me was a place where I could go and I could take off my prosthetic, I could jump in the water, and I could feel like any other kid around me, and no one would even know that I was different until I actually got out of the water and people could see that I was missing a leg. I just looked the same as everybody else, and I had the same opportunity put in front of me as everybody else. And it was probably the only environment where I felt that. So I've always loved the swimming pool because it was kind of where I started off my Paralympic career, of course, but it was a place where I could have the same opportunities as the child who was sitting next to me, and I had a choice over what I could or couldn't do.
When was the first time, because we're talking, hugely positive about, the disability and, what happened to yourself. But when was was there ever a time growing up where you actually realised that, God, I have got a disability?
Not until I was much older, actually. I was a pretty naive kid. Because I had the support of my twin sister and I was always doing everything alongside her, I was achieving, the same things that she was in terms of sport and athletic achievements or physical achievements. I never really saw my disability as a disability in a way. And I grew up going through primary school. Everyone that I went to primary school with, I met when I was just 5 years old. So they became very used to the fact that I did have one as well. And it almost was like, it just was never acknowledged. And it never really was acknowledged in a way where it set me back either. So I grew up in a really positive environment within my schooling system and my family life as well. And it probably wasn't until I was actually in year 6 when I was 12 years old, where, oh no, I would have been a bit younger than that, but my sports teacher told me that I needed to sit this particular basketball game out because I couldn't move as quickly as the other kids. And she was right, like I couldn't. When I said, what do you mean? She said, because of your prosthetic. And I was like, this beep, like I'm going to bleep myself here. But
go for it, Ellie. Go on, go for it.
I was so upset, and that's always stuck with me for some reason because she really could have seen.
She limited you to a disability, basically, that you in your head at that age didn't believe that you had. Right? You were just, like you said, kid, happy-go-lucky, young age.
And if she'd just given me the opportunity and the chance, she could have seen what I could have done. And something very similar happened a couple of weeks ago, I was in the jungle for a reality television show that's quite popular. And one of the other campmates nominated me for a rock climbing challenge. And I got to this rock climbing wall and they made me stand down at the bottom and sent someone else up this rock climbing wall. I love rock climbing. I could have done that wall. But then all this social commentary happened saying, I don't think that they sent Ellie up the wall because she has a disability. And the whole reason why I went on that show was to challenge the idea of what it is to have a disability. So that really annoyed me as well.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Ellie, I'm surprised you didn't go get out of the way and just go up the wall and climb the wall anyway. But going back to that year 6 moment, was that a start of a negative seed in your head that you were fighting against that gave you even more determination to go to prove, to put the middle finger up and go, F you? Did that help you in your quest to become a Paralympic champion?
I don't think it put a seed of negativity in me. I think it made me realize quite quickly that there are people that are going to be in your life or you're going to cross paths with in your life who aren't educated in particular areas in the way that they should be. And so I actually took it more of a responsibility of this is what she believes because it's the information that she's been presented with up until now. And so I really took that as a responsibility when I was a Paralympic athlete to be able to really challenge the way that people think. And I will never hold the way that somebody thinks against them personally because it's the information that they've received up until that point and it's their own perceptions of the world. So I have always taken it as a responsibility to make sure that I challenge that as much as I can. And that's why I've loved the Paralympic movement so much and probably why I was on the Australian swim team for 17 years because I could really see some positive momentum from I suppose my performances in the swimming pool and the performances of my entire Paralympic team. I could see some amazing momentum and I think that momentum's getting stronger and stronger every single game cycle. But I saw such a difference in sport between Olympic and Paralympic sport when I first started. Around Sydney 2000 Olympics, that's when I was really inspired to become an elite athlete. I didn't even know about the Paralympics in Sydney 2000. And so my heroes were Petria Thomas and Susie O'Neill. And I wanted to be Susie O'Neill desperately because I didn't have anything else to aspire to at that point in time. And then I saw the Paralympic Games in 2004 and knew I wanted to become a Paralympian, but I saw a completely different world for the Paralympics than the Olympics in terms of the way that, they were commercially sponsored, the way that they were valued as athletes, the way that they were funded. Like it was so different and it still is, but it's becoming better because of the awareness that's happening around the Paralympic movement.
When did you realise that you were going to represent your country, that you were on the Australian swimming team? When did that call come up? And can you remember that moment where they were like, right, you're going to represent your country? How old are you? And do you remember where you were when you got that call?
So
that's a big moment, right?
Yeah, it was a big moment because I had really only just discovered the Paralympic movement. I'd only been familiar with the Paralympic movement for about 2 years up until this point, or 2 or 3 years. And I got the call up when I actually went to the Australian swimming trials. So every year we have the Australian swimming trials and that's where you go if you want to qualify for the Australian swim team that year. And I had a phenomenal competition at that trials and I just scraped onto the Australian swimming team to go to the 2006 World Swimming Championships. You don't actually get a call up. You have to wait until the end of the week after all of the swimming trials are finished and then you get a tap on the shoulder and say you're on the Australian swim team. Meet me in this meeting room in half an hour where we'll do the induction. That's how it happened. How
did that feel though? Is obviously there's all bags of nerves. I can imagine, leading up to it, thinking, have you done enough?
Yeah. So being 14 years old, I don't think I understood the full gravity of what I was walking into. I was also still quite naive. I pretty much have spent my whole life being quite naive, actually. And I was by far the most excited person in the room. Everyone else on the swim team was in the early to mid-20s. I was 14 years old and I was so excited. I think I annoyed everybody on that team for the whole 3 weeks we were away. And I didn't really understand, like I said, the gravity of being an Australian dolphin, which is what we call our swimmers on team. I remember competing at that World Swimming Championships, and before my 100-meter backstroke final, I the whistle blew and I jumped into the water. I was about to say both feet, 1 foot into the water. And I looked up at my swimming coach and I was waving at her right before they said, take your marks. And she was like, Ellie, focus. But reflecting on my whole career, I've never actually been one to go through the same motions behind the blocks as all of the other swimmers. I've always been the one who has had a bit more fun with it. I haven't been focusing. I'm always the one that's kind of just having a good time and I think it takes the pressure off, to be honest. And I remember my coach telling me that this is the way that swimmers approach the blocks before a race. You have to be really serious. You have to take 4 breaths and blah. Like it was almost methodical. And I just never wanted to do that. I always had a lot of fun with my racing.
When you talk about swimming, you've got a huge smile on your face. Did you love it? Were you really, really passionate about it? I suppose you have to be at that set. Or were you just found out it's something that you were good at? Was that still your safe space growing older, all through your teenage years and your adult years? Did you carry that on from that young age of 3?
So swimming, definitely started out to be my safe space. I think I was so excited when I first represented Australia because it was still kind of off the back of the Sydney 2000 Olympics. And I just felt like, wow, these are the same footsteps that Ian Thorpe and Susie O'Neill have walked in. Like I knew that it was prestigious as much as I didn't really understand the full gravity and the impact that it could have. And so I loved the idea of being like the heroes that I admired when I was growing up. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about swimming at the beginning. In terms of the safe space, the swimming pool actually stopped being my safe space when I was about 16 or 17 years old. And that's probably when I struggled the most in my life mentally because I had this safe space that I'd had for my entire life. And then that safe space got violated in a way and was taken away from me, and I didn't have that safe space anymore. And there was a few really rough years in my swimming career when I was an Australian Institute of Sport athlete. And it was a very much win at all costs mentality and do whatever it takes to win. And I didn't consider any part of myself as a human person, really. And it was quite damaging, and I needed to take a few years off after that experience. But I found my love for the sport again, and why did
that happen, Ellie? Could you mind taking us back to that part of your life where it was no longer a safe space?
High performance sport. This is all obviously just my experience, but high performance sport, in my experience, has been really interesting because when you're a young child and you see your Olympic or Paralympic heroes on the television screen, you know that you want to be like them, but you don't really understand the physical and emotional work that it takes to be able to get to the top of your game. And it's almost like the pressure to perform and what it takes to perform is drip fed to you so slowly during a long period of time that you don't really realize what you're in until you're already neck deep in it. And certain behaviors, certain environments almost become acceptable to you that if you stand out of the box that you're standing in and look in, you're like, this is not a safe environment for somebody to be in for a long period of time. But when you're in it, you don't see it until you've retired in a way, or until it blindsides you and punches you in the face. And so that's kind of the experience that I had, where I knew that I wanted to be a high-performing athlete. I didn't realize the culture or the effort or I suppose the win-at-all-cost mentality that would take until I was already neck-deep in it. And so my experience was I had moved to high-performance training program. I'd just finished high school, so I was expected to be a full-time athlete. I was training 10 times a week in the pool for 2.5 hours a session. So sometimes 5 hours a day in the pool, 3 hours a day in the gym. But the interesting part about the environment that I was in is that I lived on residence And so I was a very insular environment where everything that I did was around becoming a gold medalist athlete. And so I lived at the pool. I only lived with athletes. I wasn't allowed to live off residence. I wasn't allowed to work. I wasn't even really allowed to date at the time. And so everything that I did was controlled, and it was a very controlled environment, and I didn't get any autonomy over who I was. Obviously, with athletes back then, physique was critically important. So we would get our skin folds taken. We would be told, you know, you have to look this way, you have to eat this way, you have to behave this way, you have to train this way. And if you're injured, just ignore it and keep pushing.
You said that you had a bad couple of years. When did the bubble burst and you take a step back and go, right, I need to do things a bit differently, in order, again, to fall in love with the sport?
It was interesting because I suppose the bubble burst for me after the London 2012 games. So this experience that I was having, it was in the lead into the London 2012 games, so from 2009 to 2012. And so the bubble began to burst a couple of months before the London 2012 games. I had some pretty significant shoulder injuries by that stage where I couldn't actually lift my arms above 90 degrees. I couldn't wash my hair. I couldn't take a jacket off. And then I was still swimming like 10 kilometers a day on these shoulders that were effectively being torn off my arms. And so that was happening. I had pretty significant injuries. And then there are a few cultural things that were happening within my program that weren't pleasant to be around. And so the bubble started bursting in the lead up to the London 2012 games. And so they brought in different management for my swim team in the lead into those games. But then my coach at the time was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and so had to step away. And then we had to move up to Queensland a couple of months before we actually headed off to the London 2012 games. So it was a really bad experience in hindsight going into those games. And then once those games finished, I came home and I just fell into this heap, and I didn't know who I was because I'd never been able to really, over the last 3 years anyway, I'd changed so much as a person, but I'd never had any autonomy or decision making over who that person was going to be. And so by the time I got to the end of it, I didn't know who I was. And it was really tough, and I did not have a good association with the sport at all, and needed to take, I think I took 2.5 years out of the pool to just mentally recover from that experience. It was awful.
You've skipped over quite an important bit there, because you just went, the 2012 Olympics, and this is what I went through. But even more impressive, I suppose, with what you were going through from 2010 to 2012, you still went to the 2012 Olympic Games and came away with gold, right?
Yeah.
It's so. Can we quickly go back to that moment of winning the gold medal, please?
Yeah, we can do that. I guess. Yeah, those games were certainly interesting because I didn't have the best headspace going into those games, but I knew that I'd put in an incredible amount of work and I didn't want that work to go to waste. And particularly with my coach having a terminal illness, I also wanted to make sure that I'd finish the job that we'd set out to do and perform really well for him. And I did end up winning 4 gold and 2 bronze at the London 2012 games, but I was
just a small thing to skip over. Right, listen, I want to know what it was like knowing that you've won gold. The moment you entered the water, was it like, I've got this?
I was pretty confident within myself before those races that I won. The first race that I won over there was the 100 meters backstroke event, and I knew that my back end, so second 50 out of the 100, was faster than anybody else in the field. And so I knew that if I had turned first at the 50-meter mark, that I would win the race. And so I remember doing that tumble turn and looking at my biggest threat in the pool and seeing that she was behind. And I knew from that moment, I'm like, I've just got to finish this.
So were you just like that for the other half, the other 50? You're just like, la la,
no.
la la. I'm off to get my gold medal.
I'll see you on the podium.
Yeah, I'll see you on the podium.
No, it wasn't like that. It was a huge sense of relief to win that medal, though, because once you've won that gold medal, you're a gold medalist.
Yeah, tell me about that, because obviously there's the build-up, there's the anticipation, don't forget the hard work, the isolation, the mental resilience and emotional resilience that you need to become a gold medal winner. But what did that sort of get off your shoulders?
I think it's a huge relief because, as I mentioned, no one really understands the work that goes into winning a gold medal. Now, just because you put that work in doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to win one. It's actually, you've got a very small chance of winning. So to be able to put that work in, to put my whole life on hold, to almost not even know who I was at the other end, and then to be able to be rewarded with the highest accolade that you could in sport, that was the relief, because it gave a acknowledgement to the effort that you had put in. But it's interesting. I remember watching the Tokyo Olympic Games and seeing Ariane Titmus, who had a very successful games. When you win a gold medal early in your swimming program and you still have events on after, you can't even really celebrate or sit in that moment for too long, because you still have a job to do. You still have other events to perform. It doesn't mean that, you can kick your feet up and have a good time and sit back and retire for the rest of your life. In fact, you've got to warm down and get ready for an event the next morning. So you can't even really enjoy that moment. And so that's something that I wasn't really expecting, and is a bit of a shame, because it is a huge achievement, but you can't sit in that achievement. But it's something, I'm telling you, that you celebrate very hard when you get home from the games. You have the best celebration of your life.
So you clean up at 2012 London Olympics. Talk to me about the is it separation between the Paralympics and the Olympics? Was it obvious at the 2012 games? Were you quite shocked about it?
Yeah, I was. I wasn't shocked about it at all, because it had been something that I'd grown quite accustomed to, being a para athlete for most of my life. But at that point, the London 2012 Games, the Olympic and Paralympic movement was still quite segregated, in that, obviously Olympians were very celebrated. Like, I won 4 gold medals at London and no one knew me from a bar of soap. My next door neighbour wouldn't have even known who I was. And so you had to really carry out who you were as an athlete, not for any kind of praise from the public or any commercial sponsors that you may receive from being a successful athlete. You genuinely had to compete because you wanted to, and you had that self-ambition to do that as a Paralympian back then. Obviously, things are a bit different now with the integration between Olympics and Paralympics. But back in 2012, it was very, very segregated. The Paralympics weren't even on mainstream television at the time, and, receiving very minimal airtime, if at all. And so you really did have to do the sport and sacrifice a lot in your life simply because you had a huge goal that you wanted to achieve. And that was the only reason why you ever would become a Paralympian back then.
So you were in a complete professional, focused headspace. Well, I've just got to get this job done. Did you manage to take an outside step from, everything that was going on and actually realise what you'd achieved?
In terms of realising what I'd achieved, that didn't really come until this year, really. But in terms of falling back in love with the sport again, I took 2.5 years out of the sport. I needed to get my shoulders reconstructed and rehabilitated for one. And 2, I needed to mentally take a step back from high performance, because I mentioned, the culture around the high performance space wasn't the best place to be in long term anyway. And so I actually didn't really know, as I mentioned, who I was at the time. I didn't have any skill sets. I was still studying at university, but I had never had a job in my life. And so I decided that I don't have any skills. I'm going to become a swim coach. And so I started coaching young kids, and I was teaching kids from the age of 9 to 12 years old about how to become an athlete in terms of, how to race. These kids were just entering the arena of racing and competing in swimming. And I really grew attached to these kids that I was coaching. I was coaching about 15 of them. And I was so proud of them. Every time, they were all incredibly hard workers. They had amazing work ethic, particularly for their age. And every time they competed and did well, I became really emotional. I was very invested in their swimming journeys. And that's actually how I fell in love with the sport again. It was through reconnecting with, community sport and grassroots sport, and being really proud of these young athletes. And I think the moment that really connected for me and wanting to get back into the sport is I was at Macquarie Park in Sydney, and I was at this ice skating rink, and I was watching this young girl who was ice skating. I didn't know her, but she was so talented. And I remember saying to my partner, look how talented this girl is. She could make the Olympics one day. And my partner said, well, you're a Paralympian, you're a gold medalist, you're talented as well. And that's the first moment in time I ever really actually acknowledged it. And it made me quite emotional because I was kind of acknowledging everybody else in my life except for me. And so that's something I know that I don't do that well, is acknowledge what my achievements have been. And even last week, I was with our chef de mission, so our team general manager for Paris, Paralympic team. And I said to her, because they're taking a whole bunch of medals, Olympic and Paralympic medals, over to Paris to showcase in a museum. And so they asked for one of my gold medals, and Anna Mears is donating to this museum for the Paris Olympics 6 of her gold medals. And I said to our chef de mission, I was like, did you know that Anna Mears has 6 gold medals? Like, that's crazy. And she said back to me, she's like, Ellie, you've got 6 as well.
I like that. Tap on the shoulder. Hello,
oh my
Ellie.
gosh. So I do acknowledge that that's something that I'm not very good at.
When did Rio come on your radar?
So Rio came on my radar. I got back into just general club swimming through the club that I was coaching with. And so that's how I got back into swimming. And then I decided I wanted to try and make that Rio Paralympic team whilst training at the club that had almost fostered my emotional rehabilitation into the sport. And so I almost wanted to do it for my swimming club and like the community grassroots thing. And I think because that safe space of the swimming pool had been taken away from me, this club that I was swimming with had given me the safe space back. And so I felt like I needed to say thank you, and the best way that I could do that was to represent them on a world stage. Castle Hill RSL Dolphins. And I did a pretty good job in Rio. I won a few.
Come on, tell us.
2
Come
gold
on,
medals
Ellie.
in Rio. I don't know. I can't remember. I honestly can't.
Amazing. That's phenomenal. Are you as confident as the 2012 Olympics? And obviously you're in a better headspace now. So did you have a lot different experience going into Rio than you did into London?
Oh, it was a different experience. I was as confident, but in a different way. I was much more at peace with being a person as well as an athlete, not just some gold medal winning robot. So I was looking at Rio through a very different lens. But it's hard for me to answer this because the race that I had in Rio that won the gold medal, I'm so disappointed with that race and how I swam it that whilst I was as confident, I wasn't as happy with the results. And that's why I came back for another games in Tokyo, because I was going to retire in Rio. And then I was like, I can't retire after that shocking race. I know that I won, but
even though you got gold,
I can't.
It wasn't enough.
I can't.
And why do you think that is, Ellie? Just going back to your headspace, your mindset, and your elite mindset. Is it because you knew you could have swam better, or you could be better as an individual? What was it? Was it the external? I could have swam that better, or I know I can do better as a individual.
I think it was the process of the race itself. So athletes are very process driven. We're very fortunate in our current day and age where we have a team of exercise scientists and physiologists who pull out 1%ers from all of this data. And so we rely quite heavily on data as an athlete. We'll do a heat swim. They'll do a heap of data about that, all of these graphs, and you can pinpoint exactly where your weakest moments were in that particular race. So I know in Rio, in the between 25 and 35 meters, I dropped my stroke rate. So my stroke rate went from 47 to 43, and that is not acceptable to me.
Wow.
And so I know that I could have done better in that event. And I always chase perfection in my race. And what I mean by that is to make sure that my race data was as consistent as it could have been and that I didn't drop the ball anywhere.
And are you in the same mindset now with everything that you do in life, or have you managed to not untrain your mind, I suppose, but unwire that part? Because I suppose you'll just be beating yourself up every single day.
If you see it as an opportunity, you don't beat yourself up. I think one thing that I've really taken away from my swimming career and translated that into my life now is that I know that everything that we do is a learning process, and you can chase perfection, but you can't be perfect. And I love really constructive feedback. And I feel like a lot of people are so scared to offer feedback because they're worried about how somebody is going to react to being told that they're not doing something well. So I think one thing that I have taken into my life now is that I actually prefer to not do things. Well, no, of course I want to do things to a high standard, but I understand that to get to a point of being very elite at something, whether that's doing the dishes, whether that's hanging your washing, whether that's changing world politics, to become elite at something, it does take practice. And so I don't beat myself up at all over anything because I know that my standards are incredibly high and I know that I will do the work to get there. And as long as I'm willing to do the work, then I can't beat myself up. As soon as I give up and sit down and say, no, I'm not doing this anymore, that is the bit that I'll beat myself up over.
Got you.
Yeah.
So you go from London to Rio to Tokyo, more medals in Tokyo. But an important question, I suppose, and I know it's important for you as well. What was the difference like, from London to Rio to Tokyo in, acceptance, inclusivity of the Paralympics and the Olympic Games? Did you see an obvious change during the three, and how's it sitting now?
I saw huge change begin as soon as the Paralympics signed a television rights deal on the same network that the Olympic Games were on. So at the Rio Games, both of those Olympics and Paralympics were on Network 7. And because they were both on Network 7, those athletes were being supported by the same commercial partners. So a commercial partner would want to sponsor a few Olympic athletes and a few Paralympic athletes and do a whole bunch of advertising and promotion of that commercial support. And so the more visibility that Paralympic athletes had, whether that was on television networks, whether that was in advertising campaigns, just getting faces of Paralympians out there and stories of Paralympians out there. I find advertising campaigns around Paralympic athletes are so bloody powerful. It's spine tingling. They're amazing. But the more visibility that we've had, effectively, that's being translating into the Paralympic movement becoming even bigger and even bigger and even bigger. And this Games in particular coming up in Paris, you're going to see Paralympians more than you ever have before. And so it really does make a huge difference, as well as social media. Paralympic athletes being able to have their own voice now and be able to tell the stories and showcase what they want to show. Obviously, Paralympic athletes love showing, for me, when I was an athlete, I love showing single leg deadlifts and just doing badass things on my social media because I was able to show people what I could do finally. And that's what I'd been wanting to do for my whole life. So to be able to have social media and be able to have networks promoting the Paralympics has made a huge difference. And Paralympians are household names now. So it's been amazing.
No, absolutely. They are indeed. And another important note, you are a mother.
Yeah.
How old?
4.5-month-old little boy.
Listen, I'm surprised you've made it to the podcast, if I'm being honest, Ellie. 4.5. What's it like being a mum?
It's amazing. It's interesting because I'm not actually I've never been maternal or anything, and I wasn't sure what my experience of being a mum was going to be like. But I remember holding him on the very first day that he was born and being like, oh my gosh, I couldn't look at anything else apart from his cute little face. And you hear it all the time. People talk about their kids growing up, but they do grow very quickly and he is learning very quickly. And at the moment, my favorite thing in the morning is to wake up. He sleeps in a co-sleeper next to me and he's always looking at me when I wake up and he just gives me the biggest smile. And he's the best. His name's Felix and he was born with as much hair as Patrick Dempsey, so I think he's going to be a bit of a heartbreaker. He's got great hair. He almost needs a haircut. He's starting to get a mullet.
Wow, at the age. Listen, I'm envious. Mine's going, but listen, we won't talk about that. Do you think we've got a swimmer on our hands? Have you chucked him in the bath yet? And
oh yeah, he loves the bath.
Can you identify a few strokes that he's doing? Or
yeah, I do. I teach him. I've already taught him how to do breaststroke kick, but
brilliant.
I want to get him to lots of different sports. I'm not sure which one will stick with him, but it's interesting because being an athlete was incredibly hard in terms of the physical exhaustion that you feel the entire time you're training. Being a mum is exhausting, but I actually think it's not as hard as being a swimmer. In terms of, I actually get more sleep now than I did when I was a swimmer, and I have more energy now than I did when I was a swimmer. And so I feel like after retiring from sport, everything is easier. But he's also a very easy baby. He sleeps, I probably shouldn't say this, but he sleeps through the night. So,
yes. a lot of envious mums out there.
I know, I'm so sorry. But he's starting to teeth, so he's crying a lot now. So I'm like, please stop crying. But every time he cries, I just put him in the bath because he loves it.
He's a water baby. Well, Ellie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Phenomenal career. How many medals are you giving over to the museum?
Just one.
Just one.
I'm not Anna Mears. I didn't even know I had 6 to give. So
yeah, listen, keep them. One's enough. One's enough. Keep your achievements. Listen, thanks ever so much, Ellie. And again, I look forward to seeing you on our TV screens very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much for joining me on Headgame. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories. And leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Ant Middleton. Catch you again